Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about metaphysics, physics, and politics. These may not sound like they're related, but they are. However, I can't really do the topic justice on this channel because I am still somewhat restricted, and I don't really trust the intelligence synthetica or Al Gore and his rhythm to allow me complete free speech. I have created another channel where, if you can find me, I don't want to be too explicit on where it is on this channel because I don't want the intelligence synthetica following me over there as well, but I have a little more freedom over there to talk. But I will say this for now. People have noticed that the progressive era that we were in, that we're actually coming out of, the world seems realigning. It's shifting more toward the right. But that's because the promises that progressives made of a freer, fairer, more tolerant world that was more rational never came about. And the shift towards this progressivism really started in the early 2000s with the rise of the new atheism, which itself was not a grassroots movement that just spontaneously emerged as people began questioning religion and realizing there's no rational basis to it, and as individuals began leaving it with some shining lights making us brave enough to admit that. 4 writers who wrote initially independently of each other, but who were deeply interested in religion and its damaging effects on society, wrote books wholly separately from each other that caught on and became popular because there was deep public interest. That's not really what happened. The new atheism was an astroturf movement. It was designed and implemented by a handful of elites, which isn't really that hard to prove. Most people don't talk about this even when they talk about the new atheism. We actually accept the mythos that the 4 horsemen of the new atheism just sort of fell into the new atheism movement, that they started as 4 separate writers who worked independently of each other with no intention of any sort of movement, and only came together as the 4 horsemen of the new atheism after their books were released and after people started associating them and their ideas were resonating with people. But in reality, all 4 horsemen of the new atheism had deep ties to the Edge Foundation and to various secular humanist organizations that themselves were all intra-related and cooperative with each other. And they traveled in the same circles. They all knew each other before the new atheism. In fact, all 4 of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism were approached by John Brockman, the founder of the Edge Foundation, to be part of his New Humanism project. And John Brockman was also the literary agent for all 4 horsemen of the new atheism. John Brockman, of course, received most of his funding for the Edge Foundation by a man whose name I can't really use, but we'll call him Jack Epstein. And I think most people listening to this video will know who I'm talking about when I say Jack Epstein. He had an island in the islands named after Mary, the Mother of God. One of them was a small island named after St. Thomas. I'm dancing around the explicit names, but I think people can know what I'm talking about. And the atheism movement itself wasn't really new. The new atheism was a revival movement of 19th and early 20th century atheist and secular humanist arguments. And this is important to note because most people don't seem to really be aware of that. And the people who are still say that old atheists may have rolled their eyes at religion and saw it as silly, but the new atheism was different in that it was aggressive and evangelical in its approach. But even that wasn't new in the new atheism. Atheists in the mid-19th to mid-20th century were very aggressive and militantly atheist. So there was nothing new about it. In fact, the arguments that were made within the pages of The End of Faith, The God Delusion, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, and Breaking the Spell, as well as the sequels written by Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. Dawkins' sequels, I can't remember the titles off the top of my head, and I don't have internet access, so I can't just look them up while I'm making this recording. But Sam Harris also wrote Letter to a Christian Nation and The Moral Landscape. He wrote a couple of other books, but I didn't read those, at least not yet. But nothing in those books were new arguments. The new atheists, the four horsemen of the new atheists specifically, simply quoted old arguments from the 19th century with some modification. They did update the language to a few of them, maybe added a few things, but for the most part, the arguments themselves were 19th and early 20th century arguments. And it's not a case where they just looked at the evidence and followed it where it led and came to the same conclusion independently. I know a lot of atheists like saying that's what happened, and that it's possible for two different people to arrive at the same conclusion based on the same evidence. But it's obvious that that's not what happened, because they would often make the same mistakes that 19th century writers made when it comes to historical facts or scientific facts. They would use the same terminology. They would often reference slogans that had been popular in humanist circles for a long time. And sometimes they would just straight up plagiarize older works. Christopher Hitchens, who is this great intellect and towering, brilliant mind in the popular reception, just straight up plagiarized previous atheist works, especially Chapman Cohen. His book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, just straight lifts from Chapman Cohen without ever mentioning the name Chapman Cohen or referencing that he got the material from it. So Hitchens was, in fact, a plagiarist. But no one seems to hold it against him or even talk about it. He's the great Christopher Hitchens, after all, the brilliant investigative journalist who exposed the fraud of Mother Teresa, the ghoul of Calcutta, the brilliant mind who wrote God is Not Great because he has such a deep intellect who came up with his own ideas, and the brilliant debater. I never understood why people loved Hitchens that much. It's almost like he was an evil wizard casting a spell. And for some reason I was immune to it. Because Hitchens was bombastic. He was polemic. And in debates, he relied heavily on the double standard our society applies to Christians as opposed to atheists. Christians have to be polite, and the minute a Christian makes a harsh joke at the expense of an atheist, it exposes the evils of religion and how religion truly has poisoned his mind and made him evil. But when the atheist mocks relentlessly religion and religious people and ridicules Christianity mercilessly, it's simply an example of his brilliance. The truth is, Hitchens never had a good argument. Even if I were to concede that the arguments that were made within his debates or within his books were good, and they weren't, they were all terrible, but for the sake of argument, they weren't his arguments, they were someone else's that he just stole. And when put on the spot and given something he couldn't answer, he would just bully and intimidate and ridicule people, acting as if mocking them proved that what they were saying was so stupid that all it deserved was mockery. In fact, he even outright stated that this was the case a few times, that your idea is so absurd that, sir, all you deserve is my mockery and my contempt. Well, he did that not because the idea was so patently absurd on its face that it just deserved mockery and ridicule and contempt. He did it because he had no answer, because he wasn't a brilliant mind. He was just a polemicist. But the reason this is important is because the new atheism was not really a group of people who merely lacked belief in a God, insufficient evidence, writing about the damage that religion caused and crying for its abolition with nothing else in common but their lack of belief in a God and desire for us to enter a secular age free of religious superstition and nonsense because we need humanity to progress, but with very different views on everything else. They had largely the same views on everything. They were progressive politically. And that's because their atheism was not just a lack of belief in a God due to insufficient evidence. Their atheism was a belief that no God existed. And I don't really think any of them truly believes there is no God at a deep level, but human psychology is complex. You can convince yourself that something is true even when you know it's not. Which is ironic because that would make them delusional. And at the same time, that's what they call religious people. All religious people are delusional. At the same time, to be delusional is to refuse to believe something even after you've been shown evidence that it's false, and they refuse to show evidence that God doesn't exist, insisting they merely lack belief, have made no claims, and have no burden of proof, and that the sole burden of proof is on the theist. But that's just a lie, too. When you call someone delusional, you are saying that their beliefs are false, and that it has been proven false by evidence, and that they refuse to accept the evidence that they are wrong. By calling people delusional for believing in God, you are saying that they have been shown evidence that God does not exist, that their belief in God has been proven wrong, that God does not really exist, and the evidence proves that God does not exist. That is what delusional means. If God is a delusion, then God is something that has been proven wrong with evidence. But they never show the evidence, because they don't have to show the evidence. They merely lack belief, and the sole burden of proof is on the theist. The atheist movement was cowardly and dishonest. And nowhere was this dishonesty ever abated. It seeped into everything they said. These people weren't towering intellects who knew what they were talking about. They weren't deeply researched. Most of what they did was read other atheist websites and other atheist books and other atheist periodicals and then quote their arguments. Arguments that had at this time become received wisdom. And ultimately, in the biggest irony of all, dogmas of an atheistic religion. And as ridiculous as what I said would sound if you're an atheist listening to this and you hate religion and you mock it, and you know we religious people often commit the fallacy of calling atheism a religion and know exactly how to respond to me, keep in mind that simply ridiculing me for calling atheism a religion by pointing out that atheism is a mere lack of belief in a God, and how can a lack of belief be a religion, and telling me atheism is a religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. Keep in mind two facts. The first fact is, you can't prove me wrong when I call atheism a religion just by saying I'm wrong, atheism is not a religion, and then insisting that atheism is really a lack of belief in a God, especially after what I just said. Because atheism is not just a lack of belief in a God. So me calling atheism a religion is not me saying a lack of belief in a God is a religion. Just asserting that atheism is not a religion, atheism is a lack of belief in a God, does not prove that atheism is not a religion, and it does not prove that atheism is a lack of belief in a God. Neither does appealing to the dictionary and saying dictionaries define atheism as a lack of belief in a God, especially since atheism only started being defined as a lack of belief in a God in dictionaries after the new atheism movement got really popular and the atheist community bullied dictionaries into changing the definition? The definition of atheism has always been a belief that no gods exist. And Anthony Flew in the 1970s was the first person to actually define atheism as a lack of belief in a god. And I know the atheist community has debunked that as false history, and they've proven that previous atheists also defined atheism as a lack of belief in a god, like Bertrand Russell and Robert Ingersoll and Charles Bradlaugh. And you even have the quotes to prove it. They definitely defined atheism as a lack of belief. Well, no, they didn't. None of the quotes that you use that you get from rationality rules actually proves that they understood their atheism to be a lack of belief in a god. None of the quotes say that. You're reading that into the quote and then claiming it's the plain reading, and claiming that anyone like me who says it's not what they mean or is using mental gymnastics. But accusing me of using mental gymnastics doesn't prove me wrong. It's just a trite, overused bullying tactic. But therein lies the point. I called atheism a religion. You can't prove me wrong, which brings me to my second point here. I said you follow an atheistic religion, and for some reason atheists always hear me saying, atheism is a religion, because they've been brainwashed into thinking religious people call atheism a religion. And that means that I must be saying that. I'm a typical religious person, I'm an apologist, and I'm saying atheism is a religion. Really, I'm not saying that, though, even though I just defended calling atheism a religion. And that's because I know I'm going to be accused of calling atheism a religion anyway, and now I'm going to be accused of being a liar. Since I called atheism a religion, then I denied calling atheism a religion. But in reality, I said you follow an atheistic religion. I did not say atheism is a religion. And there is a difference. Even though you've already stopped listening at this point and are just pointing to the earlier part of the video where I admitted that I called atheism a religion, and you're ignoring the fact that I'm doing that for the sake of argument because I already know what you people are saying and I just wanted to address that part first. The truth is, atheistic is not atheism. I did not say you're following a religion called atheism. I'm saying your religion is atheistic. I'm not saying all atheists have the same religion. But in the Western world, in the modern world, 90% of the atheists follow a form of secular humanism. And even the ones like Alex O'Connor, who claim they are not secular humanists because they value animal life equally to human life, really are still secular humanists because they have all of their beliefs in common with secular humanism. Their ideas came out of secular humanism. And the only reason they don't call themselves secular humanists anymore is because they don't like the idea that calling yourself a humanist means you think you're better than animals. But humanism isn't defined as thinking you're better than animals. In fact, the humanist manifestos themselves make it very plain that you're not. And that's the whole point. Alex O'Connor is being dishonest by saying he is not a secular humanist. We're supposed to listen to that and say, well, I guess we can't apply anything we know about secular humanism to Alex O'Connor. He clearly thinks for himself. He's clearly coming up with his own ideas. We have to throw away everything we know about humanism and just listen to, it'll take years to understand. I know who Alex O'Connor is. He is a secular humanist who denies being a secular humanist. He agrees with everything in the manifestos. But therein lies the point. You see, the new atheist movement was an attempt to revive humanism and progressivism, which in the minds of a lot of people today are united as the same thing. That's why the overwhelming majority of atheists today are progressives, or at the very least, left of center. They're usually more than just left of center. They're usually very left-wing. And that's because atheism is a belief Atheism is not a lack of belief, and like every belief, you can't hold it in a vacuum. In fact, that's how we know that atheism can't be a lack of belief in a God anyway. You see, even though I know atheists who listen to this, if they've gotten this far in, usually they don't listen this far in, but even if they do, are going to twist my words, and I know exactly how because it's always the same way, and they're going to twist it into me saying, once an idea has been introduced to you, you must believe the idea is true. The reality is, I'm not saying that once an idea has been introduced to you, you must accept the idea is true. I'm really not saying that. I will repeat that a second time. I am not saying that you must think every idea you have been exposed to is true. I will repeat that a third time. I am not saying that once you have been introduced to an idea, you must believe that that idea is true. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that you cannot lack belief once an idea is introduced. And that's because the human mind is analog and not digital. In a digital system, you can tell a system to assign a value of 0 to something and to ignore it, and it will act as if it doesn't know it. But that's not how organic minds work. It's not how the human mind works. To the human mind, once you have been introduced to an idea, you must address that idea. You must come to terms with that idea, and you must connect that idea to all the other ideas in your head. Because in real life, animals cannot think in terms of abstract ideas that don't relate to any other idea. They can't just disconnect something and hold it off. There will always be a web connecting all thoughts to all other thoughts in your mind. And even accepting the faith-based dogma of the holy religion of atheism, that we are all born atheists because we're all born lacking belief in a God and only believe in God because we are indoctrinated as babies before we learn reason. You have to understand that even accepting that God doesn't really exist, God is a figment of the imagination, and people only believe in God because they're indoctrinated as babies, it is still a belief that you have been exposed to, that your mind is reacting to. And atheists react to the idea of God by rejecting it. No one's really born an atheist. And I mean that for two reasons. The first is even accepting that when we're born we lack belief in a God. Atheism is an active rejection of theism. It is not a lack of belief. I've already covered that. Anthony Flew made that definition up. People decide to be atheists. And yes, atheist, I know it's popular to deny free will and say, you can't choose your beliefs. Spare me that garbage. Even if I accept that free will doesn't exist and you don't actually choose your beliefs, we're going to have to use some contextualized language to communicate. And it doesn't matter at this point, not for this conversation. But the point is that to be an atheist is to negate theism. It is not to lack belief. And ultimately, every atheist who argues about religion has heard the word God, knows the concept of God. They may not know all the nuances and details about what people who believe in God mean by God, but they know, they have a vague idea of what God is, at least. They know what God is. What's more, we probably instinctively know about God. And the whole argument that we're born atheists is just silly presuppositional nonsense, predicated on the idea that God does not exist and that God was imaginary and has to be able to be taught him. It's all just presupposition. There's no evidence for it. And when you ask an atheist about it, they'll just say, well, how else would it be? Or, can you prove that babies believe in God? If you can't, you have to accept I'm right and they like belief. And you don't have to accept that. Even if you can't prove what you're saying, that doesn't automatically mean that they're right. But therein lies the point. The modern atheist movement won't even be honest that the people who follow it reject theism. It's obvious from what they say and their words. They'll even have sites that say, reject theism. Just say no to gods, and they have things like that. But then when you confront them with this, they'll say, no, I just lack belief. No burden of proof. And there's a fundamental dishonesty in this. And it's a dishonesty that's become a habit of the mind for people who bought into the new atheism. They refuse to accept that the new atheism is tied to left-wing politics and insist, atheism is just a lack of belief. You can be conservative or liberal, not like religion, which makes you be right-wing. Which is silly, because there's plenty of left-wing religious people as well. And again, the atheist community is a religious community. The idea that atheists are not religious is a cultural conceit. But the reason this is important to talk about is because we've already tried the atheist ideas for a perfect world, or to at least an improved world. And it was such a failure that the atheist community has to pretend it had nothing to do with atheism, and in fact was the fault of religion. And I'm talking, of course, about communism. Because even though someone like Sam Harris will roll his eyes and once again explain how communism had nothing to do with atheism, it was actually a form of religion, or it was religious thinking's fault that caused all the atrocities, the truth is, communism was rooted in atheism. It was rooted in materialism. And people who talk about liberation theology, that they're not really trying to have a serious conversation about history or philosophy. They're trying to find a loophole to prove communism has nothing whatsoever to do with atheism. And they also ignore the fact that a lot of liberation theologians didn't really believe in God either, and even if they did, that's a minor subset that happened in South America and doesn't really affect the Soviet Union or China, or even Cuba for that matter. And that's the point. Matt Dillahunty, in a debate once, said that we have never tried secular humanism as a society. We have never had a society based on secular humanism. He's arguing for it, how it would be better, but we have never tried it. But we have. The Soviet Union was a secular humanist state. And so is communist China. So are all communist countries. That's because secular humanism goes back to the 19th century. It's not a pre-Christian ancient Greek and Roman creation. It goes back to the 19th century. And it was the idea that fueled the Soviet era. If you go back to the Enlightenment and follow its course to Feuerbach and the Neo-Hegelians, and you follow it from there, the development of thought that led to the Soviet Union came directly out of the progressive movement and directly out of materialism and directly out of the assumptions of human nature that were presented by Feuerbach and elaborated on by Marx and Freud. The entire framework for the progressive movement is stuck in a 19th century anthropology. Which is why it doesn't work, by the way. But it's also why they need so hard to pretend it has nothing to do with secular humanism and nothing to do with atheism. Because it was a spectacular failure, because it brought about authoritarianism, because it brought about tyranny. And it never at the end gave us the advanced society that they had promised. And they want us to believe that now it would, that modern day atheists are holding the torch of reason, enlightening the world, bringing us liberation from all religious superstition, including communism, which is actually religious and nothing like us. But they have exactly the same beliefs the communists have. They have an anthropology that tells them that we are material beings in a materialist world, and all of our problems are ultimately material, and that human society is shaped purely by its material and economic conditions, and that if you implement the correct policies and the correct economic structures and provide for everyone's wants and needs, that all crime and all societal problems would go away. You do this by abolishing all hierarchies, leveling everyone into equals, having a classless society, and making all material goods shared in common so that everyone has what they want or need. And this has never worked. And while it's been modified to some extent, and not everyone goes full-bore communist, this is the underlying assumption that is being made. And ultimately, it leads to the same problems every single time. One of the problems that it leads to is the fact that there's this automatic assumption that once religion and tradition and the established hierarchy are all abolished, then people will just naturally embrace the humanist ideas, because the only reason people don't embrace these ideas is because of religion poisoning their minds. And religion will die in the face of the advancement of science, reason, and technology, because we'll have all these great things that come about. And when that fails to happen, they need experts who know and understand the world better than us to guide us to that enlightened future. And they never really seem to stop and ask themselves how compatible it is to have a world of equals where no one is above everyone else, that is led by shepherding experts who very clearly become a class above the common man. And keep in mind, I'm not arguing that because I'm saying that they're hypocrites and that we need real equality, not an expert-led society. I don't believe in having an egalitarian society where we're all equals. I'm a monarchist, for crying out loud. But I'm talking about how irrational their views are. And their views are irrational. Their views simply don't make sense. They honestly tell themselves that they are creating a world of equality where no one is above anyone else, while at the same time enshrining their experts as elites who are above us. And they're telling themselves they're not doing what they're doing, while at the same time justifying what they're doing by saying it's necessary because stupid humanity has to be brought kicking and screaming into enlightenment. That's where the authoritarian comes from. You see, most modern authoritarians are not driven by a desire for power. And Lord Acton, for all of his wisdom, was wrong when he said power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power doesn't corrupt, but ideals can. And if you have a fundamentally wrong view of what is good and what is true, and the nature of man, and if you want to implement your utopian vision under the assumption that humanity is infinitely malleable and can be made to conform to your views, then when that doesn't happen, the impulse is never to revise your ideas and admit you may be wrong about how humans work. The impulse is invariably to see the people as enslaved to a false consciousness, enslaved to false ideas, enslaved to the superstitions of religion and the traditions who chain you. In fact, the Internationale in English has a line about that. It talks about, no more traditions, chains shall bind us. They see tradition as slavery, chains that bind us. They don't understand that tradition often speaks to a deep aspect of human nature that's already there. To them, we can just dispense it and create the new utopian world. And that is why they lead to an expert class that's needed to guide us to that utopia. And it's no different between the Soviets and the modern new atheists. And the reason this is important to talk about is because the progressive movement that grew out of the new atheism 20 years ago has now become the governing philosophy that people grew up with. People like Keir Starmer, the UK's first openly atheist prime minister. They all grew up 20, 25 years ago listening to Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Misconcetions owning the religious and destroying religion, and hearing how religion and right-wing fanaticism are destroying society, and how we need to keep these people far from power because they'll blow up the world to bring Jesus back in a nuclear war, and how religion produces all the istophobisms that we'll see, and that only a secular enlightenment can bring us about the perfect world that we want. And when they grew up and they assumed power, they started implementing those ideas that had already been implemented in the Soviet Union, but which they were confident had never been tried before. The Soviet Union was actually a religious superstition, no different than others. And then they started doing the same things the Soviets did. They start removing free speech. They start removing freedom of religion. They start restricting religion. They start telling Christians they can't even run for office. Now, they didn't get to the point where they officially declare that you have to be an atheist to be in their parties. But they did say that you can be a Christian fine, but that basically reduces to you can go to church services and participate in ceremonies led by people in funny hats and pray your mumbo-jumbo to your sky daddy. But at the end of the day, you must accept humanism as supreme, and you must accept humanist values. You cannot argue for Christian perspectives. You must be a secularist 6 days out of 7 of the week. In fact, you must be a secularist 7 days out of the week. You're just a secularist who attends rituals led by people with funny hats and mumbling prayers to Sky Daddy. The Lib Dems in the UK proved this. A man was openly Christian and discriminated against because of his views. It may seem contradictory because they really love Muslims, but that's because the woke movement grew out of the new atheism, but didn't stay confined to it and attracted other people. And once you started buying into oppressed groups, they started seeing Muslims as oppressed. And let's face reality, the people who were in charge of the movements, the new atheism, they were not the common names that we associate with the new atheism. People like Bill Gates and John Brockman, the literary agent of the Horsemen, founder of the Edge Foundation, the Steven Pinker, various other people that were pulling the strings behind the scenes. Well, maybe not Pinker. I think Pinker, while he wasn't a new atheist, he was more of an adjacent writer to them. He may not have been pulling the strings, but we have very wealthy people like Klaus Schwab, and they promote people like Noah Yuval Harari specifically to preach their message, that they're the ones really behind this. And they're also behind other liberalizing and progressive trends and the World Economic Forum. And while they would certainly prefer, in their parlance, religion to die for reason to prevail, they're not as hardcore as their hirelings are. But they do want, at the end of the day, for everyone to embrace their humanist views and their humanist values. And they're perfectly willing to strip the UK of freedom of speech and to use codes of conduct to enforce their beliefs. But the reason they're more okay with Islam, like I said, not the rank-and-file progressives. I honestly think they believe that Muslims are an oppressed minority group of brown-skinned people that we must protect. They have that racial and identitarian ideas where Christians are the enemy, and they unite with the oppressed, seeing themselves as liberators. That's what motivates them. But the people in charge don't really see it that way. They do see Christianity as an obstacle, because even liberal forms of Christianity give credence to Christian teachings that ultimately oppose their program. And people can easily go back to traditional teachings. They would prefer Christianity to be abolished. But they don't like Islam either, and they don't really view Islam as oppressed minority. But they do view Islam as useful, because they're hoping that by flooding Western countries with Muslims from the Third World, they will dissolve the cultural identity of Western Europe and America, and they will ultimately use Muslims to discredit Christianity, and they'll ultimately turn on Muslims. The elites, if they get away with it, they would turn on the Muslims eventually. That once Christianity ceases to be a relevant force at all, they would then turn on the Muslims. The Muslims are just being exploited and used as a weapon against Christianity, conservatism, and the traditional culture. Because they want to destroy the existing culture to build their utopian culture. And the only way they know to do that is to create this tumult and this wave of replacement. And then after they've destroyed any sense of cultural unity or history, then they can impose their humanist and progressive values. And that's why they're doing what they're doing. And at the end of the day, it rests on a materialist and humanist value system that will always produce tyranny while telling us it's giving us freedom, because it's based on the myth that human nature is malleable, that religion is just a projection, and that religious belief and traditional beliefs enslave us into a false consciousness that they are trying to get rid of. So they actually see attacking religion and attacking tradition and attacking nationalism as freeing us from false consciousness, and themselves as the liberators. And that's why they become tyrants. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you. God bless. And goodbye.